Hello everyone, welcome to this video. We're going to be looking at Pulp Fiction and the specialist study area of auteur, like specifically experimental auteur. Now this PowerPoint and this video are geared towards A-level film students who are sitting the WJC / EDUQAS component 2 paper experimental film. Now the video is recorded just as a stream of consciousness in one take, so there's going to be ums, ahs, throughout the video, so I apologise for that, but the purpose of this video is to cover key content for our students sitting their exam and addressing the Quentin Tarantino auteur question for Pulp Fiction in component 2. Okay, so we'll just look at these past questions super quick. So the questions don't deal with auteur, but they'll give you an understanding of how to frame our study of the film and your analysis. So explore how far your chosen film or films are experimental and challenging conventional approaches to narrative. Explore how far cinematography contributes to the experimental identity of your chosen films. Well, I'll try and stay in one spot so this is consistent. Okay, so the point with this module is to test your understanding of how film can be experimental, i.e. how it deviates from the established and traditional and classical approaches to, cinematography and key elements, narrative construction, use of genre, the role of the auteur director. So the reason we're talking about this is the question you get about auteur, or any question for this module, will be about experimentation. So this auteur study has to be different and more sophisticated, basically, than the auteur study for component 1, section A. In our college, we teach Vertigo, so Hitchcock and Scott for either Blade Runner, now Alien. So that approach won't work for this module. There's a reason why this is component 2, section B. It's like a holistic examination, and you get tested on everything. So they effectively save the most challenging question to look at it like to the last. So you're going to show an understanding of not only auteur theory, and not only how Quentin Tarantino is an auteur, but how he's an auteur through his experimental approach to film. So that must be remembered as you're writing this answer. Don't just talk about general authorial signatures. It's got to be, are they experimental and how they're unique to Tarantino himself. So experimentation, the key words, it's in bold on screen, experimentation. Do not forget it. And that's what we're going to focus our analysis around. So before we try and answer this question as Quentin Tarantino, the experimental auteur, I think it's worth pointing out that in the exam you only get 20 marks, so 25, 30 minutes to write your answer. So there are an almost unlimited number of ways you could answer this question on auteur. You could focus on so many things. So this PowerPoint is not a comprehensive, exhaustive list of Tarantino's authorial signatures. It is a focused study aimed to answer the question on the previous slide. So I have chosen things that I think are the strongest and most identifiable experimental aspects of Tarantino's oeuvre. You may feel there's other areas to explore. That's fine. It's not that this is right and you're wrong. It's just that there are so many ways to attack this essay that we can't cover them all. So this essay is very prescribed and very guided. Okay, so postmodernism. Let's start with a general overview of Tarantino as a filmmaker and his approach. So in Empire, in 1994, Tarantino said of himself and his own approach, "I steal from every single movie ever made. If my work was anything, it's that I'm taking this from this and that from that and mixing them together." So one of the criticisms leveled at Tarantino throughout his career is that he's unoriginal. He takes other people's ideas and expands upon them, or just synthesizes other people's work to produce his own films. I don't think that's a very fair criticism. I'm not a massive Tarantino fan, personally, but you should be able to acknowledge genius when you see it. So I don't think that he does steal from other people's work and he's uncreative. I think he takes the best elements of other quite modern or classical films and he reinterprets them and reuses them for a postmodern audience. And that's something, if you keep that in mindset, that'll help you understand what we're going to do in this essay. Okay, so sticking with experimentation, one of the ways we can identify experimentation is through his postmodern approach. So postmodern approach, intertextuality, self-referential, fragmentation of time and space, the use of non sequiturs, parody, etc. So these are elements that Tarantino incorporates in his work and are arguably the most definable aspects of his work. For example, his fragmentation of time and space. comes through in his construction of narrative, which is always non-linear, episodic, often circular, or at least in Pulp Fiction. So again, we're not just talking about narrative points, we're talking about experimental narrative points. So again, focus on experimentation. Okay, so we'll go through some of the broad top signature features you could talk about, and then we'll focus on a few. So intertextual references all over the place. So in Pulp Fiction, for example, there are many intertextual references. Off the top of my head, the shots when we see Butch from the point of view of Marcellus in the car before he runs him over, shot for shot recreation of the interaction between Marion and her boss at the start of Psycho. The weapons that Bruce Willis's Butch picks up in the pawn shop before Butch goes down to get revenge on Zed. The weapons he picks up are all references to some of Tarantino's favourite films. The baseball bat, reference to Walking Tall, Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the chainsaw, Samurai Sword. It's Japanese cinema. I think this specific film is Lady Snowblood. It might be Baby Cart as well. Inspiration for Kill Bill, but the point is they are all intertextual references to existing things. And that's something that's found across his oeuvre. Compiled soundtracks. Tarantino famously does not have a composer. He's only ever used a composer once, Ennio Morricone, for the Western, The Hateful Eight, but a lot of the time he compiles a soundtrack. And we'll come back to that later in the video. Obsession with female feet. Obviously, that's something that is not quite unique to Tarantino, but it's definitely a signature feature. However, how experimental that is something we'll have to consider throughout this video. If you always frame women in their initial introduction with a close-up of the feet, that's relatively experimental. But the question you have to ask yourself as a student is that the strongest piece of evidence, or is there something else that could replace it that would be stronger and show a deeper level of knowledge and understanding from yourself? The boot and trunk shot. This is another good example. The boot and trunk shot usually prefigures violence in Tarantino's films. So you have a camera looking up at the characters from the boot and the boot closes. So is that experimental? Well, not really, because if you want to look at an intertextual reference, you could argue he's paying homage to Scorsese. He used that a lot in Goodfellas and others other crime films. However, Scorsese himself in interviews has talked about this, and he harkens back to his influences. So the question is it experimental? Not really. Maybe it's not even unique to Tarantino. It is a signature, but it's not experimental. So I would avoid points like that, because ultimately you're not answering the question because it's not experimental. Non-linear episodic narrative structures, yes, absolutely. Subvert realities of social structures. This is something we're going to explore more in the this video and this PowerPoint, and I think this is maybe the single most defining aspect of Tarantino's oeuvre and signature features outside of narrative. And I'll explain what this means later on, but basically it's experimenting with ideas about representation of groups and place. Excessive stylized violence, again, definitely a Tarantino thing, but is it unique to him? No. Is it experimental? No. So we can move on from that. Genre films that subvert convention. That's something that's worth looking at, because he does experiment with genre. You've got a Western, effectively a movie about American slavery, but it's one of the only movies I can think of where the film follows a slave getting revenge on the slave masters and not the other way around, as in terms of power dynamics. So that's what we mean. He subverts genre, subverts social structures. So there's definitely something there. Excuse me. Pop culture references, very interesting. Now you could say, well, other people do that, but they do that to the extent, number one, that Tarantino does it, and secondly, does it inform his interior meaning and the meaning in his films? And I would argue pop culture references are experimental, because it's how Tarantino constructs not only some character interactions, but also his mise-en-scène, sense of place, etc. So that's something we could properly look at. Lengthy shots and minimal editing. So we're going to talk about that, because that's more of a reflection of how Tarantino experiments with scene construction, and that's based on intertextual references to French New Wave, Italian neorealism. So we're going to talk about that in this essay. Black and dark humour, and the film exists in a hyper-reality but also reflects social issues. And finally, my head's in the way, uses car journeys to transition from one sequence to the next. That's interesting, but that's more, I would say, a consequence or a function of the way his narrative is constructed. It's a place where you can dump exposition. I don't really think that's experimental or unique to him, so we'll move on from that one. Okay, so There we go, Tarantino. So these are some of the points we've already explained. What we do in our lesson is ask students to rank these signature features or approaches by Tarantino to see which are the most prevalent and which are the most definitive or the most have the most impact in defining his overall oeuvre and experimental status. So you may want to do that, and that's a good way to sort of like rank and basically identify which points are more important than others, and that'll give you a good idea what to focus on in your exam. Okay, so how do we use these points in an introduction? So as this video is about helping students revise, I'll just read through the potential starting points for this essay that you can pick from, either wholesale, cherry pick points, combine them, but this is generally what you want to address. So anyone can remake a film. What makes Quentin Tarantino postmodernist is that he copies, transforms, and combines existing cinematic ideas to form new original ideas. Most aspects of Tarantino's work challenge mainstream approaches to cinema production, narrative structure, and characterization or representation. So he experiments not only in terms of technique, in terms of micro elements, he does it in terms of macro elements, narrative, genre, representation, and social issues, etc. So he's quite experimental in that way. The most notable feature of Tarantino's oeuvre is his readiness to play fast and loose with narrative conventions and his willingness to borrow from other film texts and subvert generic tropes. The use of the use of non-chronology and blurring of genres are also evidence of his postmodernism. So for this essay and this video, we use the term postmodernism as interchangeable and experimental. Okay, to be a postmodern filmmaker is by definition experimental because you are subverting and moving away from the modern / traditional classical techniques of film construction. So it's interchangeable for this essay. Okay, so it prevents familiar genre tropes, war films, crime films, westerns through non-linear narratives, and it adds a level of complexity to the film. It encourages the audience to be more active in terms of spectatorship and to form meaning in their own minds, a clear signifier of a postmodern artist. For example, what's in the briefcase in Pulp Fiction? The fact that there's no one definitive answer is interesting because that implies active spectatorship. We, as an audience member, individually fill in that gap. We fill in that narrative gap. Very postmodern. And also the fact Tarantino trusts his audience to do this. It demonstrates an element of self-reflexivity in his work. Okay, his dialogue humanizes and develops his characters rather than simply advancing narrative. So that's a point that is more to do with narrative experimentation, and that'll be in a different video or lesson. And he creates hyper-realities and encourages the audience to question what they perceive when they watch his films. Okay, so let's go through some points. Now, this is not necessarily an essay structure. It could work that way, but these are some of the points that myself and my class thought were the most significant signifiers of Tarantino's authorial approach. So let's go through it. So, okay, it's essential that you explain the single most defining aspect of his oeuvre is his experimental postmodern approach. And Tarantino's approach to genre is a key contributor to his postmodern status. So he pays homage to a variety of genres, but he also subverts the conventions. So you have a blaxploitation film starring Pam Grier as Jackie Brown. So for those who don't know, blaxploitation is a film movement that emerged predominantly in New York, East and West Coast in the 1960s, 70s, and it's when African American communities shut out of Hollywood would make their own versions of classical films. So you have you have the black versions of Universal monster movies, but you also have a spate of really intense, really pretty amazing crime films, and Pam Grier was the star of that, Foxy Brown, etc. So Jackie Brown is inspired by that, and the casting of Grier in particular is a homage to Tarantino's, one of his favourite genres, so very postmodernist approach. Okay, so Kill Bill, it's a combination of Japanese and Chinese cinema influences. It also, in Kill Bill 2, leans into more Western techniques. So he's someone who's not afraid to use genre, but also experiment and subvert and pay homage to classical films. War films, again, he makes war films, but he subverts our expectations and the genre rules. Grindhouse again. He's inspired by Hong Kong cinema, etc. So there's a lot of play, and that's a good word to use for experimentation in postmodern film, is that does the filmmaker play with ideas, and he plays with genre quite a lot. So there's like quite a basic point, but it is a good way to maybe start the essay and then develop those ideas as we go through. Okay, so excuse me. Some other examples of experimental technique. Pulp Fiction contains elements from many genres, but it's hard to pin down the genre and label the film. Tarantino's use of non-traditional narrative, reliance on experimental techniques, subversion of genre, all help define his work as postmodern or experimental. So, for example, we have the episodic nature of his narratives, even like title cards, is self-reflective because it reminds the audience they're watching a film. It breaks the suspension of disbelief. So even something as subtle as that is experimental and postmodern because it breaks the golden rule of classical cinema, which is invisibility of editing and suspension of disbelief. Tarantino was also heavily influenced by French New Wave filmmakers, specifically Jean-Luc Godard, who said, quote, "Every movie needs a beginning and a middle and an end, but not necessarily in that order." So you've got a quote from a French New Wave filmmaker who himself is declaring narrative and linear narratives are not the only form of narrative, and maybe we should move away from them. And Tarantino is clearly inspired by that. But it's not just in terms of narrative construction, it's also in terms of cinematography. So what we're going to look at now is how Tarantino, number one, uses homage, and on top of that, uses homage to inspire an experimental approach to scene construction and camera. So there's quite a few things going on here at once. Okay, so the French New Wave movement was a huge influence on Tarantino's approach to cinema. These films are the most relevant if you want to understand his experimental nature. So New Wave filmmakers rejected conventional approaches to scene construction. So we know traditional continuity editing and classical scene construction, establishing shots, you cut inside, two shots, cut to over the shoulder, shot reverse shot, things like that. So very classical construction. But Tarantino, if you notice in Pulp Fiction, he rejects that. And we've only got 20 minutes in the exam, so you don't want to talk about the whole film. You need a quite specific, focused example. So I always recommend the final scene between Jules and Vincent in the diner. Okay, so the scene that directly influences this from the New Wave is the Franglish scene from Breathless, which I'll post a link in the description below. I'm not going to play it now because the video might get blocked, but I'll post it. Okay, so if you go away and watch the scene from Breathless, then compare it to the final scene from Pulp Fiction, you'll notice a couple of things. Number one is that both sequences reject the sort of traditional classical approach to scene construction. What we don't have, for example, are shot reverse shot, for example, and this is really important, so there's no subjective point of view. Okay, so the scene begins with a wide shot of both characters in agreement, and once the characters start to disagree over the nature of the miracle or the not miracle, the camera then cuts to increasingly tighter and closer single side-on shots of Vincent and Jules. The characters are never shown again in this conversation on screen together until they walk out the diner. Okay, so rather than having one subjective point of view where we are over the shoulder of Jules and we experience the conversation from his perspective, we're not given that. So it's more of an objective point of view. So then that builds other points. The other point is that it allows us, the audience, to make our own reasoned decision on who we agree with or don't agree with. So it allows us to be a bit more active as spectators, and it reflects our self-reflexivity. It is also a reference to French New Wave, Breathless, Jean-Luc Godard. It rejects or experiments with scene construction. And this is a really good scene to demonstrate Tarantino's almost unique or at least experimental approach to scene construction using camera editing and blocking and things like that. So please watch those scenes again. And there is a second video that will be uploaded after this one that deals with camera and experimental cinematography. And this scene is analysed in much more detail in that video. The reason I'm not going into too much detail in this video is you want to avoid proper in-depth, long textual analysis in this essay because it's not required in that depth. Okay, so please check the cinematography Pulp Fiction lesson for more on this. Okay, and now we move on to another point, and this is, I think, one of the key signifiers of Tarantino's work, and I think it'll be a big part of this essay if you choose to follow this plan. So experimentation does not just limit itself to technical features like the micro and macro elements in terms of film construction, it also deals with representation. Now, a lot of the time throughout Hollywood history, different groups have been represented in very similar ways, and those, let's say, often racial stereotypes or misogynistic views, homophobic views have been reinforced through continual, repeated representation of the same tropes. One thing Tarantino is interested in, though, is deviating away from that and challenging those representations. Okay, so if we look at some interior meaning and look at Tarantino's background and how that may inform his film decisions. We know Tarantino didn't have a great relationship with his father. He talks about how he was a stepfather, and when he moved to Los Angeles, they lived in a relatively poor, and as he described, an overwhelmingly African American multicultural area. So he said he spent a lot of time around non-white people in black communities and cultural groups. But he also said every Saturday or once a weekend he would go to the cinema to watch B movies with his father, and he went to cheap cinemas. So ultimately watching black exploitation movies and films like Bruce Lee films, Hong Kong movies, Chinese martial arts movies imported that way and shown in mainstream cinemas. So he grew up on that. On top of that, his film education comes a lot from watching films. He wasn't formally educated, which we can talk about as well. But the point is that he grew up in a very multicultural environment. So a consistent theme of Tarantino's work is to focus on underdogs, traditionally underrepresented groups who challenge the predominant representations of them in media and society. So some examples. Kill Bill and Death Proof follow female characters who've been the victim of violence. They take revenge against those who victimized them. So women, historically, ostensibly victims of violence, Tarantino positions them as they create victims out of victimizers, and they are the ones who get revenge. So that's subverting this sort of representation of this social group. So that's what this phrase means: subverting realities of social structures. Inglourious Basterds. So war films generally, ostensibly, show evil Nazis perpetrating war crimes against Jewish civilians and other minority groups. Tarantino subverts or experiments with that, and he makes a film about Jewish characters taking revenge on Nazis, even killing Hitler. So he also experiments with the notion of film as a historical document. He's very, very experimental and playful with history and reality, and these are signifiers of his post-modern experimental status as an auteur. Django, an African-American slave, takes revenge against the white slave owners. So again, when you think of slavery and slave films produced in America, ostensibly you think 12 Years a Slave, films like that, and they are really awful and traumatic, but they generally depict one overall narrative, which is the victimization of African Americans by white plantation owners. Now, please don't mistake this for a criticism, it's not. That happened. It has to be confronted, and some of those films are extremely harrowing and important in educating us in the 20th and 21st century. But what Tarantino does, he wanted to see something else. He wanted to see a slave film that actually depicted slaves as heroic characters in their own narrative in a different sense than normal. So he chose Django. He subverted the Western genre. He subverted character representations, and it's something that is almost unique to Tarantino. So a way to express this in your exam or be a bit more academic about it is Pulp Fiction challenges dominant ideology surrounding African American characters at the time, mid-1990s. Jules, African American, is positioned as a peacemaker or hero of the final sequence. Most antagonists and aggressors are white men. So if you think of Zed, for example, he plays a cop or a security guard. Generally, historically, white historical characters like that have been heroic or noble or the positive force in the moral force in the narrative. However, the white men in this film are probably the most immoral, degenerate, and disgusting characters in the film, and they repeatedly victimize black characters. So most antagonists and aggressors are white men, and this challenges dominant cultural ideology and stereotypical norms of the industry at the time. So this quote I'm about to read comes from a study. I'll post a link to the study in the description. The little box where I am is, I can't move it. It's covered in the book. Anyway, the quote says, "There's no nudity and no violence directed against women. Pulp Fiction, celebrates interracial friendships and cultural diversity. There are strong women and strong black men, and the director swims against the current class stereotype." So obviously you as an individual film student and a critic of cinema and Tarantino representation, you can make your own minds up about this. And you may push back against this notion. But there is a consensus in academia that there's at least attempts and some elements of this taking place in Tarantino's work, enough to confidently say in an exam that this is something that he experiments with and it is an aspect of his work. So I would encourage you all to read about that, but that is a really strong argument. And then you need to find examples in Pulp Fiction. So for example, we've got Jules. Jules and Vincent seem to be on the same level in terms of authority, but I think it's clear that Jules seems to lead the two. He quite literally walks in front and Jules follows. He makes some of the most important decisions. He's clearly the most intelligent, the most moral. He's clearly the person who is more sophisticated as a character. I think Vincent is very interesting. He's performed brilliantly, but he's a bit of a blunt instrument. He's a pretty two-dimensional psychopathic killer for hire, whereas Jules goes on a character journey. So that's important, isn't it? That the black character of Jules and Marcellus develop, and throughout the narrative, where Vincent is doomed to repeat this violence, cycle of violence, because he doesn't develop. So keep that in mind, because when we look at narrative in a later video, that idea of Jules and Vincent's character journeys is really important for understanding the non-linear narrative and how it operates. So please come back for that video. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just run through a few other potential talking points, a few other avenues of attack, if you like. This is not all one massive essay. As I said at the start, these are trying to give students enough talking points so they can formulate their own responses and develop the ideas themselves. Okay, so podophiliac. Okay, so the idea that Tarantino has got a foot fetish has been around for quite a while. He's admitted it. It's clearly something that is prevalent in his work. So I said earlier that this is not the best point to use in an essay, because it's how experimental it is debatable. But the point is that you can use this to show how one technique or one moment in a film can demonstrate multiple things at once. Okay, so Andrew Cyrus in his book The American Cinema codified auteur theory, and he'd find it as three distinguishing features, didn't he? Technical competence, signature features, interior meaning. So what you don't want to do is look for a paragraph on each of them. You can find examples where all three of these things are being expressed at once, and the foot shot is a good way to get that knowledge across. So, for example, technical competence. The shots are really carefully crafted. They glamorize feet, are quite unique in terms of representing women, and it shows Tarantino understands how cinema works and how the relationship between the visual and framing and the audience works. So he's very technically competent. He's excellent, isn't he? It's a signature feature, so basic. It's in a lot of his films. Almost all women are introduced with either foot close-ups of feet, or in the case of Mia in Pulp Fiction, it's an extreme close-up of lips, which is a homage, and it's textual reference to the 1970s crime film The Warriors, but it's also found in all of his films, as the images on screen demonstrate, including, and this is important, the scene where Tarantino is sucking the foot at Selma Hayek. He didn't direct that film, but he authored the script, so he authored that film, and basically, interior meaning, he's got a foot fetish, so he wrote a script where he himself gets to, as play a character, and suck on the feet of Selma Hayek. So if you want an understanding of how auteur theory works and how auteur films reflect the personal desires of the filmmakers, that's pretty nailed on as an example. Okay, so the foot fetish, then interior meaning. It's done technical competence. It shows signature features. It also shows interior meaning, because it shows us that Tarantino has a sexual preoccupation with female feet, and that's what he values or fetishizes most in women. So all three of those criteria, Cyrus signified or codified, are demonstrated there. So you can use this point, but only if you use it in a sophisticated way like this. Okay, something else to consider is mise-en-scène. Okay, so mise-en-scène is a big part of auteur theory, actually, and I'm going to read a quote that came out of Cahiers du Cinema by Godard. Mise-en-scène is the expressive tool at the filmmaker's disposal, which a critic can read to determine the specificity of the cinematographic work. That is, the critic can identify the particular style of a specific filmmaker and thereby point to it as an authorial sign. So mise-en-scène, what's on screen, it doesn't just include props and things like that, but what you see on screen, what you analyse, should be consistent if it's an auteur, and you'll be able to identify the authorial signatures of that filmmaker. So we're going to use that point to also talk about intertextuality, which is an experimental postmodern feature. So it's not enough to say he uses mise-en-scène to create meaning, which effectively all filmmakers do. What he does, he uses intertextual references through mise-en-scène to create meaning in his film, but also build those more active links for audience members who build the connections themselves. Okay, so this idea of using mise-en-scène as an intertextual reference to create meaning is pretty obvious in Pulp Fiction. If you want an example from his other work across his oeuvre, remember, you also need to reference other examples of these features in his oeuvre to demonstrate it as a signature. Without the demonstration, you don't show your understanding, and therefore you compromise your mark. So Kill Bill, the yellow jumpsuit with the black stripe, is an intertextual reference to Bruce Lee's final film, Game of Death. The casting of the I can't remember her name. Sorry, the Japanese actress who plays the schoolgirl with the weapon. That actor was spotted by Tarantino in Battle Royale playing a very similar role, like a psychopathic murderous Japanese schoolgirl, and that's why she's cast Lucy Liu's character, O Ren Ishiren, as a reference to Lady Snowblood and a series of revenge films from Japan about a female samurai. So they're all over the place. Jackie Brown have already explained the intellectual references to blaxploitation films in the 1970s. So in Pulp Fiction, here's the examples you should reference in your essay. Okay, so the sword is a reference to Shogun Assassin, which also was an inspiration for Kill Bill. We have the hammer from another film. I think this is Walking Tall. Okay. Actually, the baseball bat is Walking Tall. We have the chainsaw, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These are films that Tarantino is on record as talking about influences, not only for this film, but his entire approach to cinema. So there we go. And I think a good way to tie interior meaning to this and enhance your points and show a deeper level of understanding of why and how this is unique to Tarantino is to follow him. Okay, so most filmmakers up until this point had gone through a relatively classical training program. So in the classical era, the system was maintained because all filmmakers coming through or crew members were schooled within the studio system. So they were learning the studio system and then repeating it. And then as the studios collapsed and New Hollywood's emerged, we have a new generation of university-educated filmmakers. So those filmmakers, Lucas, Coppola, Spielberg, Brian De Palma, Polly Platt, etc., all these people, filmmakers, were developing their own styles and they were learning in university. So they did learn the classical approach, but they also learned Japanese cinema, Chinese cinema, European cinema, South American cinema, third cinema, as it's called. So the New Hollywood filmmakers are New Hollywood because they had more experience in terms of world cinema and they had a greater sort of toolkit, if you like, to create more interesting and complex cinema. So Tarantino, then, he didn't do either. Okay, so he is a product of almost like a postmodern world. So Tarantino's film education came not through going to cinema, not going to school, not working in the industry. He worked in a video store and he watched lots and lots of videos and he taught himself the language of cinema, if you like. But because he was not, and he did it through watching Asian films, European films, American films, classic films, old films, silent films, musicals. He watched everything over like years. So he talks about this himself, and he talks how his lack of informal film education means that he developed an informal approach to cinema. So he is consistently playing homage to things he learnt about and was inspired by. But at the same time, he's also creating his unique approach to film construction. So because he was not formally educated in a formal system and he's effectively self-taught, his style is unique to him. Okay, so that's how you talk about his approach being very experimental and very unique to him and postmodern, is that he was not entertained within the classical system or the studio system or even the university system. He's self-taught, and that's why his films are so distinct, and that's a big signifier of his experimental auteur status. So that's a really important point. Okay, if you look at music, then another point. Okay, so more or less the way, so this is Tarantino speaking, the more or less my methods for work is you have got to find the opening sequence first. This starts it off for me. I find the personality of the piece through the music that is going to be in it. It is the rhythm of the film. Once I know where I want to do something, then it's a simple matter of me diving into my record collection and finding the songs that give me rhythm of my movie. So Tarantino does not use a composer or an orchestra, and that is the conventional, classical, traditional, modern approach. But Tarantino's postmodern, he's experimental, so he experiments and he uses compiled soundtracks. And what's interesting, he doesn't have a music person working, he does it himself. So he compiles soundtracks of existing songs, film scores, and popular tracks. And this idea of homage and self-reflexivity, a lot of the songs in Kill Bill are iconic Western themes from Ennio Morricone films and Sergio Leone Westerns, but he uses it in such a new way that it becomes new and unique to Tarantino in a way. So it's homage, but it's also creating this new postmodern approach. It's very experimental, very effective. Okay, he borrows heavily from Ennio Morricone, and he is the sole creative force behind his music. So if you want to look at that, he is not literally the author of the music, but that's not what he says and that's what he does. He is the author of the soundscape of the film. So although he didn't write the songs he chooses, he curated them. So he has created the soundscape. He didn't write the music, but he created the sound of the film. So he has authored the soundtrack. So again, it's not just in terms of he writes his own films, he casts and directs. He also creates the soundscape through this process. So very, very important point. Okay. And then we've got some points on the board. So why this is important for making his films unique and bespoke to him. The fast tempo and aggressive music picks up from the opening diner scene, and the tension reaches its climax. The tempo of the song carries the tension into the film proper. So talking about the opening, I can't remember the name, Ilazu or whatever it's called, the guitar and the top string. The idea is that's taken from the credits, and it jumps the magical gap into the diegetic, and it gives the film a lot of energy. There we go. Okay, so that's a whistle stop tour of Tarantino and Auteur. Now, as I said at the start, there's many other ways you could approach this essay. There are things that I'm sure if you're not in our college, you may have been taught, or lenses through which you look at these films that are not in this video. That's fine. It doesn't mean we're right, you're wrong, or the vice versa. There are so many ways to write this essay, and this is the mode that I think is the strongest. And for our students, I think you should use this as your primary revision resource. The only thing that's missing are references to the film itself. You guys have got to do that. So I'll with you go through the knowledge. The understanding comes from you. So this is a skeleton of an essay. Your job is to fill in the Pulp Fiction stuff and find examples of things you're talking about in his other oeuvre, and that's that. So hopefully that's helpful for Tarantino Experimental Narratives. Please feel free to leave any comments or questions at the bottom, and I'll see you in the next video.